Good afternoon. I'm David Klaus. I'm the consulting director of the Wilson Center on the Hill project. As we get going, I think people can quietly get their food. There's some seats up at, I think there's a seat or two up here, but there's also seats along the side you can see just fine. Thank you for coming. As I said, I'm the consulting director of Wilson Center on the Hill. Let me introduce Liz Byers in the back, who is also with Wilson Center on the Hill. We're a program along with Program on America and the Global Economy, run by Kent Hughes over here. For those of you who don't know, the Wilson Center was established 1968 as a living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, the only American president with a PhD, and formerly the president of Princeton University. And rather than build some tall edifice, they decided to create a living memorial in which scholars would come and study at the intersection of academic and public policy issues and things like that, and do programs such as this. So welcome here. The Wilson Center on the Hill program gives thanks to the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, which provides the funds to operate the program and for your lunch as well today. Let me share with you, before we get going, 2 dates you may want to put on your calendar. We have a program coming up next Tuesday, June 15th. These are actually 2 programs that are, if you're interested in issues related to development and what's going on in other parts of the world, we have a program called Africa's Future, Meeting the Infrastructure Challenge. If you're at all interested in understanding how Africa is going to develop, we have a woman named Vivian Foster from the World Bank who will give you an absolutely fascinating, up-to-date assessment of exactly where Africa's infrastructure is and where it needs to be in order to move development forward. And a woman named Katrin Kuhlmann from the German Marshall Fund who will share with you some very interesting insights about what's going on in terms of developing regional corridors in Africa. And it will be, if you're interested in development and understanding what's going on that continent, one of the most fascinating programs you'll see. Second program is on June 22nd. It's a program on early childhood development. A lot of folks don't know that probably about 15 years ago, there was a major move to bring Head Start to the rest of the world. And literally millions of children are going to Head Start type programs around the world. This program actually brings together some of the experts from the international Head Start programs together with U.S. Head Start programs because they've learned from each other and they've also really done some interesting things in terms of what is the benefits of early childhood development programs. And I think you'll leave there with an understanding of the importance of the world figuring out a way to help children reach their potential. With that, let me thank you for coming and introduce Jennifer Turner, who is the director of the China Environment Forum, who will be our moderator for the day. Jennifer.
Hey there, everyone. Again, you know who I am, Jennifer Turner. For our Chinese buddies, I'm Wu Lan. China Environment Forum has been around at the Wilson Center for 13 years, so we're still a relatively young and small program, but quite busy because we have been the convener, really probably the biggest convener globally on bringing energy and environmental folks together to talk about China's challenges in these areas. And just last year, the Blue Moon Fund and Rockefeller Brother Fund gave us some support to do a project called Cooperative Competitors. And I think this is at least my second or third meeting bringing some folks up to the Hill on this topic. We're trying to dig into the how and the why U.S. and China can cooperate on energy issues. Also touching, of course, on questions of climate cooperation, MRV. And what's, timing is everything. I mean, right around the time we got the grant, the whole Texas wind farm issue blew up. And so then we thought, oh, we have to dig into that jobs issue. And it's very confusing. And so what we're aspiring to do in this year and probably into next year too is to get some clarity. And, particularly around the debate of, where the jobs are in promoting clean energy. And, karmic forces came to play, and these 2 gentlemen showed up in my life who'd actually written a report that not specifically the jobs, but digging into the clean energy investments, trying to sort it out. They will give you the clarity. You have their bios, but, and I will do my best not to murder your name here, John. John Romankovitz, he's a senior analyst for China Clean Energy and Carbon Markets at Bloomberg New Energy Finance. He lived for about 3 years in China, fluent in Mandarin, which you could tell that he was on the China side of the research team here. And then you have Ethan Zindler, who's the head of the North American research at Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And he's based here in DC. and he focuses predominantly on U.S. clean energy policy. So I'm going to stop there because they're the folks you came to hear. Enjoy your lunch, and I'm going to ask you guys to teach us.
Let's see if I can fix this a little bit. Well, first, thank you very much to the Wilson Center and to Jennifer for inviting us here today. It's a real pleasure to be with you all. We've done a few briefings on the Hill before about other stuff, and so it's a real pleasure to be back. And so thanks very much for having us here. Before I get into it, just a word about who I am, what I'm doing here. Bloomberg New Energy Finance is a division of Bloomberg now. But we were an independent company started 5 years ago in London and acquired by Bloomberg just 6 months ago. And we really have one mission in life, and that is to provide accurate and timely data, research, and information about investment in the clean energy sector. We, from the start, have looked at clean energy not as a sort of social project, but as an industry, and sought to suss out the various dynamics that define it for our clients. And our clients also, generally speaking, are not people who are involved in this for charity. They are large investment banks, they are venture capital funds, they are manufacturers of wind turbines or solar modules, and actually increasingly they're government agencies, including the U.S. Department of Energy, the National Renewable Energy Lab, the United Nations, a bunch of agencies in Europe as well. There's 150 of us now globally in about 10 offices. And London remains our hub. But we have a substantial research team here in Washington and in New York as well. So with that as a background, I just want to add one last point, which is that within the sort of context of Washington, where I know there's a tremendous amount of discussion of these topics from a partisan perspective, we really do pride ourselves on this being industry information, which we want to present with a truly nonpartisan slant. This is our research and our research alone here. Now onto the main topics here. I mean, when you think of China and you think of clean energy, there may be no two more hot-button topics, well, maybe a few others, but these are pretty hot-button topics these days in Washington. Obviously, the Chinese-U.S. relationship, critical for geopolitical and economic reasons. And clean energy, the expectations now being placed on what I would call our industry are extremely high in terms of job creation and economic development. And those expectations are high on both sides of the Pacific and actually both sides of the Atlantic as well. There's a lot of expectations in Europe and a lot of investment that's gone on there as well. So with that in mind, we decided that it was time to look specifically at this issue of the U.S.-China clean energy relationship and to try and shed a little bit more light on it. Because I think our general feeling is that the debate that's taken place so far has lacked a certain level of nuance, and we're hoping that we can bring some new facts to the discussion, not to necessarily state our point of view, but to just inform a bit. So against that backdrop, we produced what we called Joined at the Hip, which is a 20-some-odd page report, which John's got some copies of, and which you can download from our website at www.newenergyfinance.com. Go to the About Us section, White Papers, and you will find it there. And we've so far talked about this in several meetings here in Washington, including with the Department of Energy. But we also presented the findings in Beijing about 3 weeks ago, both with meetings of wind turbine makers and other industry players in China, but also at the Renewable Energy Finance Forum in Beijing as well. So we've tried to sort of spread the gospel in both continents. So if there's one sort of general message that I hope that we can sort of impart to you today, and if you want to, after this one comment, go back to your BlackBerry or whatever, I won't take any offense at this point, but if there was one general message we'd want to impart is that this is if you use your whatever sports analogy you want to use here, but this is a marathon, not a sprint. This is a 9-inning game. We got a long way to go to determine who a quote-unquote winner will be in the clean energy race here. The ultimate goal of clean energy technologies is to produce power at a cost that is lower than producing power from coal or natural gas or other fossil fuels on a purely unsubsidized basis. And we're nowhere near there yet. I mean, if we're honest about the industry, you can't produce power from wind or from solar in most cases for cheaper than you can from fossil sources. So the goal is to get there. And when we do get there, that's when the great economic opportunity will be. So whatever country or countries or companies that are able to develop technologies that drive down the cost curve and get down below coal, or even within striking distance where only modest subsidies are needed to close the rest of the gap, those are the companies or countries that are going to benefit the most, and we are a long way from there. So to hyper-focus on the fact that, frankly, right now China has been attracting more money and investment in the last 2 years, that China probably runs a net trade surplus with the United States in terms of exporting clean energy equipment, is a fairly short-sighted view in my view. I think you need to look for the long term. So with that in mind, I'm going to just in a moment hand it over to John here. John has worked with our company for several years, and he's bounced back and forth, frankly, between our office in Beijing and our office in New York. So he's very knowledgeable of both markets, but particularly China, and speaks Mandarin fluently. John headed up our efforts on this research by coordinating analysts from both our office here in Washington and New York and in Beijing. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to John, and he's going to walk you through a little more detail, some of the slides that you should have, and if you don't have, I think that there are some out front still for anybody who needs them.
Or share with your neighbor if you don't have a copy.
I do have some copies if you need one.
Thank you, Ethan, and thank you to the Wilson Center for holding this event. Let's get down to the details. China's economy is growing at a grueling 8% per year, and so is its demand for energy and electricity. China's power grid has grown by more than 70 gigawatts in each of the past 5 years. At some point next year, the total installed capacity of China's grid will surpass that of the United States. Coal power and hydropower are playing the largest roles in China. But moving forward, China also has set its eyes on wind and solar power. China has set ambitious targets for the build-out of renewables and generous feed-in tariffs to support that growth. In the first chart in the packet, you see asset finance new build figures for the US and China. This reflects the amount of wind farms, investment going into building wind farms, solar farms, biomass power plants, and other renewable energy, and it reflects how much China is installing each year. From this, it is easy to see that China is ramping up, each year bigger than the last. Asset finance levels growing by an average of 86% year on year for the past 5 years. China aims to be a leader in clean energy, not only to satisfy its growing domestic demand, but also to serve the growing foreign demand as well. China has many leading manufacturers in the solar and wind space. If you look at the second PowerPoint slide, if you flip over, it shows a league table of the leading solar and wind manufacturers around the world. Of the top 10 crystalline silicon solar cell producers, 6 are Chinese: Suntech, JA Solar, Trina, Yingli, Canadian Solar, and a fun one, Solar Fun. But it's no laughing matter. They all IPO'd on New York exchanges in 2007 and 2008 and now have great access to capital. They're building large cell and module factories and are exporting their products to Germany, Spain, the US, and other countries. On the wind side, of the top 15 producers, 4 are Chinese companies, while 2 are American. The companies on this wind list are all at various stages of export potential. Vestas and GE Winds are selling their products around the world. The big 3 Chinese manufacturers, Sinovel, Goldwind, and DFSTW, which stands for Dongfang Steam Turbine Works, if you were curious, have little exports to speak of at this point, although it is their ambition to export to Turkey, India, Brazil, the US, and other markets. Let's turn back to solar for a minute. Next slide. You'll see market shares for companies shown by the country they are based in, exporting to the California PV market due to the supportive policy there known as the California Solar Initiative, which offers incentives for sub-megawatt size residential and commercial installations. It is easy to see China's rising dominance in the California market, and their timing couldn't have been more impeccable. Chinese firms have been producing their products for a number of years now. Reliability and bankability of their products has risen quickly, and solar modules have become increasingly commoditized. The Chinese module is slightly cheaper than German or US brands, and in the eyes of the consumer, the product has a similar quality. Chinese wind turbine manufacturers will have a harder time in the US market, however, principally because the market is already facing risks of oversupply. Turn your eyes to the next slide. Whereas the US has been importing in 2006 to 2009 whatever it lacked in domestic manufacturing capacity, we are bearish on demand for 2010 through 2012. And given announced plans for US facilities from other foreign firms, as well as US firms on US soil, the market will face oversupply. Chinese wind turbine manufacturers will also face technical and financial barriers in exporting to the US, as well as quality issues. Chinese turbines do not have as long of a solid operating track record as turbines made by Vestas and GE Wind, for instance. I'll make one more point back on solar. On the last slide, you'll see a value breakdown for two typical modules. One made by Suntech, a Chinese company, and one made by SunPower, a US company. There are four basic processes to making the module: raw material polysilicon production, producing silicon ingots and wafers, then cell production, and finally module assembly. Some interesting points to note here. Suntech's biggest polysilicon supply contracts are with MEMC, a US-based company. In addition to raw materials, many US firms, Applied Materials to name one, have exported large volumes of capital equipment, such as assembly lines for manufacturing sites in China, to these Chinese module manufacturers. Also interesting to note is that Suntech has plans to put a module assembly plant in the US. So often you can slap the Made in China label on modules, but be careful. Sometimes it's not all made in China. Now, are SunPower's modules made in America? Frankly, no. They have sought lower cost manufacturing sites in the Philippines, Mexico, and Poland. Given that cells and modules are easily stackable, transportable products, the shipping costs do not outweigh the savings gained from lower labor costs abroad. These were the brief and main points we wanted to get across to you today, but we want to save a lot of time for Q&A, and the full 25-page report is available online, and we do have some copies here on hand.
Oh, okay. So you're ready for some Q&A?
And, Ethan also would maybe add a few more remarks.
This works. I'm going to add just a couple more comments though, about the U.S. market, because I know there's obviously interest here in that particular market. One of the slides that John showed is slide number, I don't know what number it is, but the one that shows the China wind export challenge, and it shows the oversupply. I just want to talk about that for one more moment, just because there's a lot of expectations about jobs in the wind industry, obviously. For years there was if you look at these two lines here, the solid lines show the demand for wind turbines, and the bars, as you stack them up, show the supply of manufactured turbines on U.S. soil. And so what you can see is that up through 2009, there was essentially an imbalance where we had to import turbines to meet our demands. That is just now going to start to flip into this year and next year because of a lot of additional manufacturing capacity that's been added in the United States. And the reason why the American Wind Industry Association and others had a terrific year last year with about 10,000 megawatts of wind installed, but the reason why this year we anticipate no more than 6,000 to 8,000 at the very top level, and perhaps lower than that, is because of several reasons, which I think are important as you think about policy making. Natural gas prices have crashed. They have come down very substantially, and natural gas is the fuel against which wind generally competes most directly. And so that has made adding new wind capacity less realistic for a lot of utilities. That's the first general point. The second is, within that same context, electricity demand actually fell last year. And again, that took some pressure off adding new wind capacity. So the general point, though, that I'm making is that the market is not looking all that hot for domestic wind and frankly for solar either at this point, just on its own. So as Congress considers policy for this year and ways in which to facilitate additional growth of a U.S. clean energy sector, I think it's important to think about both sides of any equation, both supply and demand. The stimulus bill, which was passed obviously in February of 2009, I would argue was the most important piece of clean energy legislation probably ever written in the United States. Provided a tremendous amount of support to the industry and did a terrific job to some degree in tying the industry over through what would have been a very difficult year last year. But it is entirely focused on priming the supply of additional clean energy equipment at a time when the market is oversupplied. So it can only have so much actual impact on new investment. Private investors, you can give them tax breaks and credits all you want, but if they don't think that making that investment is going to result in the sale of some new equipment, they aren't going to do that. So I guess the one point I try to make about policy is that if you think about wanting to build a larger U.S. clean energy economy, you really have to think about the demand side. And obviously, the policies that people have talked about on the demand side are renewable electricity standard here in the United States. Also, some people put carbon caps within that same category. I frankly am not convinced that a carbon policy would drive the adoption of a tremendous amount of renewables because natural gas prices are so low that adding natural gas capacity is something that a lot of utilities would do to reduce their emissions. So if you want to, if the goal is to build a U.S. clean energy economy and add the jobs that would come with it, I guess the one point I would say is that don't just think about supply, also think about demand, because that is the problem currently in the industry. And then just one last point. I know there's been some discussion about this, the amendment, the Schumer potential amendment, and the idea of I guess imposing, and I'm sure there are people in this room who are more experts on what that would do, but imposing a Buy American type provision on the so-called Treasury grant program, which has funded a lot of projects. I guess our general view, and I think if you look at the research that the excellent research that John has done, is that it's very hard to source a wind turbine that is, quote unquote, American-made through and through, right? There will be Chinese equipment in that General Electric turbine you buy. There just will. And there'll probably be some American-made equipment in that Chinese turbine that you might someday buy as well. So it's not so black and white, and imposing such a program would have some interesting ramifications, which I think remain to be seen. But I guess I only point out that there is more nuance to this than I think has taken place in some of the debates so far here on Capitol Hill, and we're always happy to share whatever additional information we have about the industry to talk about the way things tend to work. So with that in mind, thank you very much, and any questions?
Okay. First, let's applaud them for being brief. I'm always grateful when people, they stuck to time. And I also think by the size of the people in the room, I think this is a sign that you all are interested in the nuances of this. So, and make sure that you do say, we want to open up first to staff and congressional staffers, and just say who you are and where you're from. Okay, and the mic's right next to you.
Joe Pinder with House Financial Services. I have a two-part solar question. You were talking about the production of panels. You didn't mention production of inverters, which is a noticeable cost to any solar installation. Where are those being made? Is China in that too? And then secondarily, panels right now are not all that terribly efficient or durable. Is the United States or China better posed to take advantage of any real developments, improvements that come in solar cells in the future? Thank you.
Inverters, there's definitely a number of both U.S. and Chinese players ramping up capacity in both in the inverter market. That is something very fair to say. I think in terms of, I think the second question you had, I'm more well poised to answer. In terms of there's always a cost and efficiency trade-off for the module that you purchase. There's a number of figures in our report about the various R&D levels that U.S. firms, publicly listed firms, are putting in relative to Chinese firms, as well as the venture investments that have gone into U.S. solar companies. About $4 billion over the past 5 years has gone into solar manufacturing firms in the U.S., a lot of which are thin film module manufacturers. So there's basically three principal types of module manufacturing. There's crystalline silicon, there's thin film silicon, and then there's thin film made from other materials, other semiconductors. So for instance, on this one sheet where we're listing the top 10 crystalline silicon cell producers, we've left off First Solar, which is producing thin film from other materials, and they actually have a module capacity of 1,100 megawatts. So if this was all cells, they would actually be out on top. And their costs are coming down quite rapidly. And it's always a cost and efficiency trade-off. But typically, Chinese modules are as efficient as the other modules on a cost basis as the German firms or the U.S. firms. And a number of Chinese firms are ramping up new lines. Yingli is introducing what they're calling their Panda line, and Suntech's introducing Pluto, getting creative with the names, but they are new products that they hope will be more competitive on this cost efficiency trade-off.
Let me add one thing on that too. Well, just quickly on inverters, there are definitely some U.S. companies, and in fact, in terms of inverter technology breakthroughs, there was a company the other day, I think I have to look up the name for you, raised about $40 or $50 million. It's looking to do micro inverters so that you don't have these great big inverter boxes next to a system, but you have them between panels, and if one of them goes out, you don't lose the whole system, you just lose the panel. The second thing, though, I would say is, the question of efficiency, that John's exactly right, that the Chinese are quite competitive on it, but I would also argue it almost doesn't matter that much. In the current market, solar modules have become quite commoditized, and it's just part of the reason why the Chinese have been able to make such inroads, is that they produce a quality of product that's more or less equal to a quote-unquote U.S.-made one, and I do put quotes around that because, as John points out, SunPower doesn't actually manufacture in the United States, but that they're basically level, and if you can buy at a lower cost, well, then you will, and that's what's gone on in California. That's why the Chinese have been making such inroads. But if you look longer term, and I think your question is a good one, and to get to my one sort of macro point here, which is to how do we get the cost of generating down below fossil fuels? Well, the answer is you do have to improve the efficiency of solar cells substantially to get there. And if you look at where the most interesting companies and most of the venture level investment has been, that has been the United States. So if there's going to be sort of a breakthrough, a major breakthrough, some sort of step change, that will more likely come here than anywhere else. And I think in terms of thinking about this question of competitiveness, the U.S. is clearly, there are clearly people in Silicon Valley or Route 128 in Boston and other places, not just those two, around the country that are thinking longer term, thinking 5 years out. How do we get to efficiency levels that are substantially higher than where we are now? So the U.S. really has been a sort of private sector R&D leader in terms of development of new technologies compared to China.
If I can leap in real quick, related to that, what you both just said, that First Solar, I mean, they have an R&D center or manufacturing in China. Does the fact that the Chinese demand is getting higher, is there ultimately a big benefit for the U.S. with First Solar going over there and other companies? Because some people have told me that when they take their clean tech and their companies to China, China's a laboratory. The market's hot. do you see any, from your standpoint, do you see that as a, does that also help the win-win?
First off, First Solar manufactures a lot of their products abroad as well. A huge facility in Malaysia, I believe. Actually, the facility in China has been announced, but the plans have not gone through yet. They would like to, what they've said, they'd like to put a very large 2 gigawatt production facility in China. That is really pending whether or not China is poised to put that much solar in the ground. They haven't announced a feed-in tariff for solar yet. But obviously some of the best solar resources are in Inner Mongolia, which is where First Solar would put their plant. It's tough to say how much benefit it would have for U.S. jobs if they're going to put a factory in China. Probably have more benefit for Chinese jobs.
Okay, but I was also wondering, bringing down the cost, improving the technology. That was the only thought.
Right. I mean, yeah, First Solar is basically, for every doubling of their capacity, their product is coming down 12%. Is their current learning curve. And so if they're installing more, they're learning more, and the cost is coming down. So, hey, it could potentially help in bringing the cost down.
Okay.
I'll just add one other thing on China and solar and this question of manufacturing over there. One thing just to be clear on is that the Chinese have been adding a tremendous amount of wind capacity, but they've been adding almost no solar capacity, not almost no, but very little. And they've regarded, and the companies over there have been very successful in regarding solar as an export product, whereas wind has been more serving the domestic market in the past 2 or 3 years with an eye towards exporting starting essentially now. And I didn't make it this year to the American Wind Energy Association show in Dallas, but there's the usual 20,000 people, and apparently the Chinese wind turbine makers really had quite a presence. They are now opening offices here and do hope to start exporting to the U.S. market, although we're rather, I guess, sort of dubious that they'll be able to do that easily. The Koreans as well are also making serious inroads. And they could make more inroads than the Chinese could, more quickly.
Okay, back to the floor. How about gentleman here in the pink and then there? Yeah, and just wait for the mic. Thanks.
Connor Branch, CSIS. Just a quick question about rare earth elements and sort of the implications of sort of a restriction on Chinese exports of rare earths, and what the implications of that could be on either, especially I suppose, wind turbine development and sort of exports.
I know just a bit about that. I mean, I think rare earth elements play a role in specific magnets for generators of certain types that may go into a wind turbine, as well as potentially batteries down the line for the electric vehicle market. China does have a large amount of the supply, and so if they cut off these needed elements, yeah, that will play a significant role in their development and ramp up in manufacturing those items. It could significantly affect things.
Okay, and in the back? And please wait for the mic, thanks.
Hi, Jeremy Fancher with Senator Tim Johnson. From my understanding, Beijing has been essentially investing in a veritable clean energy Silicon Valley, a bunch of technology parks, and areas of research and development where they've been supporting Chinese startup firms in energy research, particularly in wind and solar. I'm curious if you can speak to the prospects of success for that, and also if you see any inroads for potential involvement between the United States and China in investing in clean energy startups in China.
Okay, so the first question I could answer. Right, so just south of Beijing, there's Baoding, which is the solar valley of China, and it is where Yingli is based, as well as a number of upcoming wind manufacturers, Huiteng Blade, as well as Guodian Union, or is it United? Guodian United, it sounds like a soccer team. And I was there in 2007. Yingli had 200 or 300 megawatts. And Ethan came over just recently, 2 months ago, and we went back to Baoding, and they had 700 megawatts capacity with another 400 or 500 immediately right next to it, about to open. We couldn't go see it yet. So basically in 2 or 3 years, complete ramp up of capacity, and it's very focused on local economic jobs and support. You walk around the factory, you can see red banners with white lettering. A lot of political officials go and visit the site and realize the importance for local jobs, and they're willing to give tax benefits and maybe free or low-cost land for these huge factories. So China has a lot of these local development zones, especially on the wind side as well. A lot of deals are done locally. China has a huge number, not just these top 4 companies, but also a list of about 10 or 20 others with some manufacturing capacity already, either in a whole turbine or components. And a lot of it's based on basically local agreements. So some province like Ningxia will be putting up a huge wind farm, and a local manufacturer will win one contract to supply the 1 gigawatt of turbines that are going to be installed there, with no real long view about what they're going to do after that. But we see a lot of this kind of Chinese, not just at the federal level, but at the provincial level in China, the government's wanting to stimulate local activity, really seeing the jobs benefit. The second question, yeah.
I mean, the second question, you probably know about. There's a number of U.S.-China partnerships and things between the Department of Energy and counterparts in China. So I think there's a lot of discussions going on. In fact, just after we got back from that trip, I know the Department of Commerce had a tour in which they brought a lot of folks over there. I think generally there's opportunity there. I think there's some suspicion on the part of some American companies about intellectual property issues. I think that will certainly, that might slow some of the potential investment in Chinese joint venture type activities. I think to some degree American companies, if they want to get some of the benefits of Chinese engineering and know-how, can just build plants over there and have some of the lower cost labor and also have some of the engineering skills that are there and just own it all themselves. I mean, they're certainly open to foreign players coming in and adding capacity.
I think one thing to add is that solar and wind are the currently very much deployable and competitive products in clean energy. Long term, I think, and what was a major focus in the U.S.-China agreement, the $150 million agreement ahead of Copenhagen, was on EV, electric vehicles, and carbon capture and storage, which are more long-term technologies that could see huge potential in both nations. And so I think they're definitely looking for areas to cooperate there.
Let me follow up on your comment about the types of incentives that Chinese manufacturers are getting for local jobs and developing local plants and facilities. I think one of the questions a lot of U.S. policymakers have is whether the playing field is, if you will, level. And the U.S. has a number of incentives and opportunities, et cetera, as do the Chinese. Could you perhaps, if you will, compare the field and tell us whether you think it's tilted in one way or another from the standpoint of government policies and incentives for the Chinese, et cetera?
I'll give John a sec also. We'll both get 2 different perspectives on this. But I think what struck me, and it was my first trip to China, and John will give a more informed perspective in a moment, but what struck me is that there seems to be a broad-based kind of imperative to support these industries, and it's not just about government policy. It's about making funds, very low-interest loans available via state-owned banks or state-backed banks. It's about companies, things that we define as companies but are really half state-owned entities, being given the imperative from above that it is going to be their role in life to expand capacity and to start to export wind turbines. So I would just say that to some degree, some of the kind of political will is a little hard to kind of put your fingers around and sort of document to some degree. And that's just sort of was my sort of my take from having visited there. But I was struck by that this just seems to be a belief that this is going to be a major global market, and they will make the investments needed to build out and to try and serve that market. John, go ahead with me.
Yeah, I'd say that, I mean, obviously there's the manufacturing tax credits in the U.S., and that's the one major advantage. I'd say more so, yeah, in China, it's the access to capital and credit lines that is really helping to ramp up their capacity. Suntech can only get so much, money from its public shareholders. They have a $7.3 billion credit line now from the China Development Bank. That same bank gave a $4.4 billion credit line to Trina Solar. So clearly, these companies have proven that they can make this product, and that there's going to be more demand for it, and that was enough for this bank to sign off on a huge credit line for them to clearly ramp up.
And the last point, though, in comparing the U.S. and China, sort of back to my earlier point, is that in China, I would argue that to some degree, a fully supply-side focused policy can work, right? You subsidize the production, very substantially, and well, at least in the case of solar, there's a ready and willing overseas market to export to. Over here, I think that the government is, the Obama administration and Congress through the stimulus package has provided a great deal of support on the supply side, but virtually none on the demand side, and that will still be needed in the U.S. to add more capacity.
And China's energy growth is so huge, they've got the demand.
Right.
So, right here at this table? I try to be fair to go to different tables.
I'm Nora Todd with Mike Mishu's office. Ethan, your comment that China is open to investment and would welcome U.S. companies going over there and taking advantage of the cheap labor would be offensive to my boss, who has become a leader on the fair trade issue in Congress. Can you comment as to why the U.S. should be promoting policies, whether it's through Schumer's Buy American bill or others, to try and create manufacturing jobs in either wind or solar energy within the U.S.?
Why they should?
Why shouldn't we be adopting policies that would make it competitive for U.S. companies to produce wind or solar energy components within the U.S.? Why would we want U.S. companies to go over and invest in China and take advantage of their lower labor costs? Why wouldn't we want them to domestically produce and provide living wages for U.S. workers?
I will. As a apolitical, relatively apolitical person, I won't try to talk about motives, but I will say this: that if you want to, that our general view is that. But your point's well taken, that if you want to build manufacturing jobs in the United States, you don't want necessarily create an environment where you're encouraging people to go locate overseas. On the other hand, I think there are certain realities of the global economy these days that are very hard to come to grips with from a public policy perspective. And the reality of it is, as John pointed out, SunPower, probably the top of the line solar manufacturer in the United States, First Solar, others, they've been moving jobs over there, and it's not only because of low-cost labor, I think, in fairness. It's also because the Chinese do a spectacular job of designing and building brand new plants that can produce at lowest cost. So that is, I sometimes think that the labor issue gets a little bit overblown to some degree. There really is a question of whoever builds the newest plant builds the cheapest plant that produces at the cheapest cost, and they're building out a lot more quickly than has been happening in the United States.
Foxconn is one example of a company in China that has one of the state-of-the-art plants, and they've had the recent spate of suicides there and the increased wages there is an example of how actually that model might not be sustainable. And so is there not a policy consideration for Congress to consider that would try and promote the job growth here, because that model has its flaws as well?
I'm not disagreeing. I mean, I'm not making a political comment. I mean, that very well may be a good point. I'm just sort of talking about what the reality of the market, is these days. I mean, my only comment about, how do you go, if that's your goal, right? How do you go about that? Is it by imposing a Buy American provision on equipment that gets installed in the United States? I guess my view is I don't think that accomplishes that goal in the long run. Because what would happen is you put that in place, and what you do is you just essentially push pause on the entire United States wind market until everybody here figures out how to apply for a waiver and show that they can't build a wind turbine without importing some of the equipment from China. In the meantime, you've cost a lot of manufacturing jobs in the process. And then basically the wind industry, after that 6-month hiatus, gets going again the way it was. To me, the way, if that is your primary concern, the thing to be focused on is the long term. And the way to build a long-term U.S. clean energy economy, at least in my view, whatever your political views are, if you want to build out an economy domestically, build demand domestically. That's the way to go.
And if I could jump into that, a lot of these U.S. companies and German going to China in these markets, while China now is exporting most of their solar, there are policies coming online where they're trying to increase solar within China to build up its domestic market. And so companies go where the market is. And so, I mean, that, and I mean, am I correct on that? I mean, there are some policies, the rooftop solar, but that we see it, that in the long term, it appears China may be encouraging more solar domestically.
Yeah, actually, I mean, I mentioned Suntech wants to put a module assembly plant here. Module assembly is kind of the last part of the process. It's not that labor intensive, but they want to be closer to where they may end up selling a lot of product, i.e. California and Arizona, where they're going to put this facility. Yingli also had plans to put a module assembly facility in the U.S., but they've delayed it because they're a little more bearish on when this U.S. demand is actually going to blow up for solar. SunPower putting a facility in Poland might be because Eastern Europe is a hot new solar market.
Actually, it's such an interesting question, and I understand that this is the political sentiment of a lot of folks. One other thing I would say is, manufacturing jobs are not the only kind of jobs that there are. And if the Chinese are helping to drive down costs, the per watt cost of solar, right, then they make solar less expensive, which means there can be more market adoption, which means you can create more jobs in California or New Jersey or wherever it is, putting those things up on the roof. So it's a little more complex. I mean, you want to drive costs down wherever you can. I think that's for climate change issues and also for some economic benefits as well.
Okay, way back in the corner where I barely saw before. I have a person back there with the mic.
Danny Caddishin with Congressman
Can you stand
Phil
up so we can see it? Sorry.
Sure. Danny Caddishin with Congressman Phil Harris. Thanks for coming back, Ethan. And I think the answer to that question is very simply, my boss is Bill. Which Ethan was nice enough to talk to me about. But you talked a bit about the manufacturing tax credit, which is now actually expired in the U.S. And Ethan mentioned earlier that the cheapest manufacturing is the newest manufacturing plant. So I was a little bit confused before when you were focusing on the short-term oversupply, when one of the main premises of your talk was that this is a marathon and that it's going to be increasing worldwide in even decades to come. So I guess once again, the manufacturing tax credit extended by the CMAC to Phil here, but why do you think that the manufacturing tax credit, or do you think that it is part of the answer? Obviously, you need the demand, but for those of us concerned here with U.S. jobs, U.S. manufacturing jobs in the U.S., regardless of the company that owns it, whether they're Chinese or U.S. located in the U.S., I'd be interested to hear what you think about the MTC.
Well, of course, you've teed me up to endorse your bill, right? I will say this: that I think the manufacturer's tax credit, as it was originally offered, was a far from perfect solution in the sense that, well, first of all, who can use tax credits, right? You need to actually have earnings to take advantage of a tax credit. So if you're a new company with a cutting-edge technology that's never gone on anybody's roof or in the ground anywhere, and you've got no earnings, those tax credits are really not that helpful to you. So that's the first thing, and I know that's what Congressman Hare's bill is trying to address by making it cash instead, and I think that's probably a good idea, although I still don't think it fundamentally addresses a fundamental issue, which is that you need to create demand. I mean, make it 30% cheaper to build a manufacturing plant, but if that plant produces something that no one's going to buy, then your equity investors are going to take a bath. And so I guess I keep saying I just think that if you couple what I think are very creative and interesting supply-side policies that have been put in place and perhaps might get extended by this Congress, with a demand-side policy, you really could see the kind of sort of explosive growth that everybody wants to see, so long as the demand-side policy is written in a way that demands enough And there's been some discussion as to whether or not the renewable electricity standard, as passed the House and is considered in the Senate, really will sufficiently do that. So I'm sort of answering your question, sort of not.
Okay, how about we'll go here and here.
Hi, I'm Zach from Congressman Rush Holt's office, and I know we've been talking a lot about the supply side of it and how Congress funded it through the stimulus plan, but can you address the fundamental issue of the demand side and fostering a culture of demand in the United States? What Congress can do to foster that, and if that's possible before innovation gets to the point within the United States that we find a more efficient means for like solar energy more so than China, and is it possible to foster demand before that happens?
Well, I don't think you can foster a culture of demand, but you can foster an an economic condition of demand. I don't think utilities are going to voluntarily buy clean energy so long as it's more expensive on a per megawatt hour than fossil fuels. So, there might be other creative ways to go about it, but, setting an actual mandate seems to be the simplest way to do it. I mean, there are other things that have been done in other countries. They hold Brazil and other South American countries are very interestingly moving towards a sort of clean energy tender system where they auction off contracts, but that's easier in countries where the grid is more state-controlled and where the utilities are more state-controlled. So, given the deregulated markets that we have, it seems like, an RES is probably the most logical solution if you want to, build that kind of growth to try and, drive more investment.
Okay, and then right here. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Elaine Ulrich. I'm with Congresswoman Gifford's office. I just wanted to go back to some of your earlier comments about how the U.S. is investing more in the innovation and research, and also how the market has been highly commoditized. And I'm wondering, I mean, in many ways, I feel like Germany's really taken one for the team for the world and buying a lot of expensive solar panels. And if China wants to do that as well, I'm kind of all for letting them build some plants, buy those solar panels while they're expensive, develop some of the manufacturing technology, and then when our research and development kicks in, if you do what you're suggesting we do, which is build some plants in China, learn how to do some of the manufacturing, get the really great innovation happening here, and then start building the plants once the commodity actually reaches a point where it's cost competitive. Maybe we should be waiting just a couple of years. Do you have any thoughts on that, just to play devil's advocate and to address some of your concerns?
Mm-hmm.
It's a very good point, and we should all take a moment to thank Germany and Spain and their taxpayers. They're good people over there, and they love the environment. Basically, crystalline silicon solar panels, for every doubling of capacity installed, have come down 25% in cost, and this can be traced back to 1977 in the energy crisis when some wacky guy installed a solar panel on his trailer park or something. And this will continue. I mean, this is something similar to Moore's Law. The costs will continue to drive down, and you're right in playing devil's advocate. I'd actually like to add that China is, although it introduced some solar incentive programs domestically, it's really not installing that much yet, and they are proceeding very cautiously on the feed-in tariff because they know it costs much more than coal-fired power, whereas some wind power is already becoming competitive with coal power on very good sites. Ethan, do you have anything to add?
I completely agree with that. And Spain in particular, we owe a debt of gratitude to. But I would say this, that doesn't necessarily mean that you say, okay, I would say that we're getting closer, though, now to the sort of the promised land in terms of getting, and in fact, one of the pieces of research that our solar team produced, I don't know, like 6 months ago, was to look at markets where actually photovoltaics will be cost competitive, in a very short period of time. They're already potentially in Hawaii within 6 to 12 months, and even in parts of potentially Italy as well. It all depends on how tight is the electricity market that you're operating in and how much solar resource have you got there, although it's even more important about how tight the electricity market is. So I would say that I think you're right, but I also think that, you know, if the U.S. were to say, you know, for devil's advocate, okay, let's wait 5 years and then we'll jump into the game, I think a lot of opportunity would be missed potentially, because there is innovation that doesn't just come from the lab, but comes from actually working on building newer and newer assembly lines now, in which the costs come down each time you add a new one. So I think missing out on those opportunities, purely from a competitive standpoint, might not be the smartest thing to do.
Okay, we have time for a few more questions. How about, we'll go quick, right? 1, 2, Kent, and you. We can do these 4 real quick. Succinct questions, succinct answers. A lot of curiosity in this room.
I'm Ken Jacobson with the House Science and Technology Committee. I'd like to go back to rare earths. To what extent does the possibility of a shortage of rare earth materials coming from China to the United States affect the development of investment and production capacity for wind turbine generators, and if you know it, for plug-in hybrid batteries here in this country?
I'll be honest with you, I don't know the specific answer to either of those questions in terms of any level of detail, but our firm, we have about 80 analysts, and I know one of others do, so let me get your card and give you a more detail, because I know there were a few other questions before we finish up.
And actually, we had David Sandlow was giving a talk, and he mentioned too that actually the term rare, they're not really that rare, and there are some mines being reopened, I think in California. Somewhere, and if you give me your card too, because I think on the DOE webpage there's a report on this. So all is not gloom and doom. Okay. Yeah,
I think it might be slightly exaggerated. I know the New York Times writes about it every like 6 months, and it might be not that worthy of that much press.
Okay.
But we will get back to you on a real answer.
Okay. I'm Celeste Drake. I'm with Linda Sanchez, and I have 2 really quick questions.
Yeah.
The first one, you talked about from the very beginning about getting price more competitive for wind and solar and for fossil fuels. And I'm wondering how you're determining that price. And are you saying the price of producing power with fossil fuels, are you including all the subsidies that they're already getting? And would just eliminating some of those subsidies, you know, equalize it, make it more competitive? And then secondly, you talked about wind oversupply in part due to increased conservation efforts. And it seems like, so that there was lower demand, that some of the best kind of energy mines in the country, like at the Northeast Energy Efficiency Project and the Midwest Energy Efficiency Project, are saying that the way to go, we're going to get a lot more bang for a buck by doing more conservation and actually lowering demand than by all this like techno stuff. And if that's the case, and we keep reducing demand, what's going to happen? Or is this all just going to stagnate and we're going to go back to oil and coal and whatever?
Real quick, on the second question, the reason why demand has dropped has not been because of any wonderful energy efficient measures or conservation. It's been because the economy has just been not so great, as we know. I completely agree with you that this, as many people have said, energy efficiency is the low-hanging fruit. It is much cheaper. The megawatt, as it is, as they say, is much cheaper than a new renewable megawatt. I completely agree with that, and you know, that's a question for Congress and others to decide from a policy perspective where you place, you know, priorities on that kind of thing. The one thing I will say from a policy perspective about efficiency is it's harder to measure an effective policy for efficiency, in my view, than it is for renewables. You can go out and count how many modules, how many wind turbines you put up, and you know if your renewables policy worked. Whether or not you know, this amount of capacity was reduced or whatever because of a policy is very hard to determine, I would say. And your other question. Yeah, the Bingaman bill actually, as you probably know, has a lot of efficiency. You know, a big chunk of that renewable electricity standard could be met through efficiency. And in fact, one of the things that we feel is that that bill doesn't necessarily add as much renewables as the sort of headline figure suggests, because of the very reason that you raise, which is that energy efficiency is a much cheaper option. And so that's the option that will be exploited first, understandably, by players in the industry before renewables. And so that pushes back by several years the point at which renewable demand will kick up as much as I think that the committee might have expected, maybe. But your first question, sorry.
Oh, just about the the cost of fossil fuels being
in terms of,
competitive.
yeah, I mean, when we talk about levelized cost of energy, we are attempting to strip out subsidies, and your point's well taken, that if you padded in the fossil price with, I mean, you name, people define subsidies in a lot of different ways. You want to include, the Iraq War and your cost of oil, or some people will add all kinds of things, right? So the gap closes, but it doesn't close all the way.
Okay, we've got Kent, and then you in the green.
Kent Hughes at the Wilson Center. Thank you for a very thought-provoking presentation. I wanted to pick up on, and appreciated your emphasis on demand as well as supply, and wanted to pick up on your insight in terms of the link between a manufacturing base and innovation and how they really can complement one another. But in this area, we seem to have lagged behind Germany, Japan, China, and so forth. And particularly in the case of some of our competitors, we face a situation in which there's a clear national priority, there's substantial subsidies, direct and indirect, and in many cases there's a serious currency imbalance. If we were to decide that having a substantial alternative energy base here in the U.S., I'd love to see you spell out a strategy for us over the next 5 years. What kind of public policies and private sector incentives should we adopt?
Is that your next paper, maybe?
Well, I mean, we're not. Yeah, I mean, we don't make policies, but I mean, if you were just to ask, I mean, our perspective comes very much from the market, and so we try and think about how would the market react to certain types of signals. The one thing that seems clear, and John was alluding to it earlier with Germany and Spain, is as your question suggests, is that if you go through sort of the history of the last 5 years of clean energy, what is the sort of thing that triggers a deluge of new investment in a particular country? It is not whether or not the sun shines really well there. It is what the policies are. And so, if you put the right policies in place, the money follows, and that's been the history, and that could be the case in the United States as well. I guess my own view is that I keep saying this like a broken record here, but on the supply side, the policies of the stimulus package strike me as a pretty generous and, for the most part, fairly well thought out set of policies that could and maybe should be extended by Congress. And then on the demand side, given the way in which this market operates compared to others and the sort of lack of state ownership of utilities and other things, at least the best thing I can think of is as a renewable electricity standard in terms of providing investors and manufacturers with the confidence that there will be long-term demand in this market, because that's constantly been a question, is whether the PTC here or it's gone, and you got these 30 state-level RPSs and they're complicated and they don't talk to each other nicely, and so that would really some overlay that gives the entire industry confidence that 5 years out there's going to have to be X number of gigawatts installed in the United States. Period. To me, that's the simplest way to go about it. John, you have any other suggestions?
Okay, to close this out, you got some.
Hi, Melissa Cheatham with the House Energy and Commerce Committee. You mentioned EVs as a possible longer-term clean energy solution, and we've seen a lot of headlines, BYD in China, all the majors over here. Can you comment on what you're seeing and what the balance is between our countries on that?
I think, well, China has always been trying to gain significance in the international automobile market, and they've really been ramping up their production just in general of automobiles. I think, China may be even quicker to adopt some electric vehicles simply because of the question of range. So in the United States, we put very much value on having a full tank of gas range, like a 300 to 400 mile range before we have to refuel, because we often drive between DC and New York or DC and Boston. In China, for personal car ownership, most people just drive within their own city. So that could be something that's like an interesting model if they can drive the cost down pretty quickly. These Chinese companies who are making the batteries and making the vehicles, there could be a quicker adoption there. There's also some interesting companies, Coda, for instance, where there's been a lot of discussion of whether their cars are Chinese or American. A lot of parts are flowing both ways, and it's an interesting company to look at. Coda Automotive.
Okay. We always like starting and ending on time. But before I do my final shameless advertisement for my project, could we applaud these guys one more time? And a lot of you are new faces to me, and I really hope that those of you who really seem interested in the nuances of the U.S.-China energy cooperation come see me or my assistant Pete back there. Love to put you on your list. We have a meeting on the power sector reform in both countries on the 24th. We've got the head of FERC here and some smart U.S. folks that are working in China on this. We've got green transport coming at the end of the month. So yeah, so please come see us again. And he has to say
No, I was going to say just one last word. Please do sign up. I know that for some of Jennifer's meetings, you actually have to tread a little bit off the premises of the Capitol, but we'll continue to try and bring you programs here as well.
But my meetings are all webcast too, so you could hang here. I can. But then you don't get the coffee and scones. Okay. All right. Thanks again for coming.